Today we're removing and replacing a neutral safety switch on an Acura MDX. This particular one happens to be a 2006, and the procedure is either to take the battery and the hold down out with the box to get down to this area down here to the transmission range switch. In doing so, that process requires you to get the radio and the navigation system codes, which you'll have to re-enter back into the system when you hook the battery back up, as well as resetting the window regulator, which is a fairly simple process. But what I've chosen to do instead is to remove this lower dust shield and go in through the bottom to get to the neutral safety switch, also known as the transmission range switch. Okay, so I have since removed the lever which goes to the gear shift. You can see it hanging there, and that fits on top of the neutral safety switch there. If you can see, there's a little notch with that line that is in the neutral position, the gear shift lever technically. That needs to be lined up with that line in order to get this nut off, and you will use a 6mm wrench on the threaded part, which is the gear shifter, and it's a 7/8 of an inch wrench to remove that lock nut off, to then remove the transmission range switch, which is held on, as you can see, with two 10mm bolts. That is our next step. Right there you can see where the plug-in plugs into it. Now that we have the bolts out of the transmission range switch, what we are now going to do is try to make sure that this pin stays even with this line in the neutral position, because that's how the new switch is going to fit back on to this rod. And we remove the two bolts here, and then all you do at this point is to slowly remove the switch off of the rod. And this is the switch that we're removing, and we will be replacing it with this switch here, and this will go back on the same way. Now that we have the new switch installed, we are now going to hook the linkage back up, and there's a little bendable tab that you have to bend back in place to hold the linkage rod in place. Both the larger 7/8 inch lock nut, which goes onto the transmission rod, and the two 10mm bolts that hold the transmission range switch in place, say to be torqued to around 8 foot-pounds. What that means is you want to go pretty light. When you remove the other switch, you'll see that those nuts aren't torqued real tight, so you do not want to strip those out when you torque them back into place. Now put the linkage back into place, and there's a few other things you'll want to check before you start the engine, or try to start the engine. Okay, so I have the switch in. A couple important things here they don't tell you first. This little indent right here, I've gone ahead and marked with a P is in park. They don't tell you that from the beginning because I wasn't sure whether it should be in neutral or in park, but you can't put it in neutral because you can't take the key out of the ignition to start. So, important factor. Also, you're going to need a wrench on here to be able to tighten this. Actually, you don't want to do that. Here to tighten this nut, 6mm on the shaft itself. When you put the linkage on here, On the back side is a cotter pin, which you'll need to try to bend back in place, which is quite hard to do. But when you're first putting it back together, this line is going to be your neutral point when you're putting these pieces back together. In order to get the linkage back in place, though, you are going to need to put this rod back in the park position. So I've marked this with a P from the very beginning. Now I still need to get in the car and put it through the ranges to make sure the lights line up correctly, and also start the engine to make sure that it starts in park and not in like first gear or something like that. But it should start both in park and in neutral, which the line would show here. And then you also want to make sure to check your reverse lights in reverse. So you might need someone to help you make sure those lights come on. So we'll check that in just a minute, and I'll be right back. So I didn't mention in the last part, but you want to make sure that you plug the switch back in, the connector, the electrical connector to the switch. Make sure it's plugged in. Next, put your foot on the brake. You're going to put the ignition key to the second notch on your ignition switch, and then you're going to make sure that you are reading park, and then you're going to make sure that it starts in park. It does. I'm going to turn it off, put it back to the number 2 position. Going to make sure that it's in neutral. Make sure it starts. That's a check. And while it's still in the number 2 position on the ignition, you're going to go through the ranges of gears from park all the way through D 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and make sure that the lights correspond to that on your instrument panel, to make sure that all those are matching correctly. Start it again, and I've gone to the back already and make sure my reverse lights come on in reverse, so you'll want to make sure that that is the case as well. And if that's done, you have successfully changed your neutral safety switch, also known as the transmission range switch. Thank you.